All right. Good morning, everyone. Or should I try, Glenn? The Lord be with you. It worked. Let us study. Well, it's so great to see so many of you out. We're switching gears. We were doing Love of Enemies, really quite a powerful series, actually really got to me. And we finished with Martin Luther King Jr. last week. We'll be staying in America, though, for the rest of the time now. And we're doing a series that I've called The Spirit of Religious and Civil Liberty. And that's a phrase that shows up during this era. The first person that I think uses it exactly in that sentence is a fellow we'll look at in a few weeks called Jonathan Mayhew. John Adams said that Mayhew's sermon that he preached in 1750 was the match that ignited the American Revolution. We'll see. Thomas Paine usually gets the credit for that, but Mayhew probably deserves his own. And he says something about if this sermon, which was published, helps to sustain the spirit of religious and civic liberty, then my work will not have been in vain. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting phrase, religious and civic liberty. And then I started seeing it over and over again. There's a sermon by John Witherspoon that he gave in 1776, where he talks about it after Washington's inaugurated, and he gives a Thanksgiving proclamation. All these communities, religious communities, write to him, including a Hebrew community in Newport, Rhode Island. We'll talk about Rhode Island in a minute. And the Methodists write him, Asbury writes him a letter, and the Congregationalists write him, and many of them say, and we give thanks for the spirit of religious and civic liberty that we enjoy in this country. So the two things are seen as essentially connected. You can't have civic liberty without religious liberty, and you can't have religious liberty without civic liberty. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I think that combination really starts to show up explicitly in the mid-1700s, but you will see it starts to show up earlier than that, a century earlier, in people like Roger Williams. So it's really great. I'm thrilled that we're doing this series for the 250th. And as you know, this is a very contentious, argued position now. Is the United States a Christian nation? What kind of nation is it, et cetera? So we'll be looking at how that has developed actually along the way, the role of religious people in the development of the idea of American freedom. So, and we're starting with one of my favorite people in the Christian tradition, Roger Williams. I have to confess, my wife found out a couple of years ago that she is a descendant of Roger Williams. And her mother's name is Mary. Her middle name is Mary. Roger Williams' wife's name was Mary. And the name Mary shows up in the Gentry clan. That's the line, her mother's line is where it comes from Williams. And so I thought, well, you show off, you. So I'll teach him, and people think I'm cool because I'm teaching him, but I'm not a descendant. So anyway, I just think that's awesome. So anyway, so she sort of reinforced my impression of Roger Williams. So without further ado, Roger Williams actually grew out of the Anglican Church, right? So he was born in 1603 in London, and he was educated in Cambridge. So he got, and Cambridge was known as kind of the seedbed of the dissenters in England. Oxford was more sort of the loyalists of the Church of England and the more quote unquote orthodox traditionalists, and Cambridge was where the real rabble-rousers came from. So it's not surprising that Williams graduated from Cambridge. And he graduated in 1629, and that's the year he also married Mary Bernard. So there we go. And actually, the Bernard would be a French name. So I'm wondering if she was actually a Huguenot in her background. I don't know that for a fact. He was quickly gravitating, though, toward the separatist Puritan camp. As you may know, the Puritans had two approaches. One approach was to work within the Church of England for reform, and the other was you just have to leave the Church of England. The Church of England's it's hopeless. It's never going to be reformed. You have to start a church independently of it. And Williams gravitated very quickly. He was probably part of the Reform the Church from Within group, but then quickly moved to you have to leave, right? We usually think of the people who came over to Boston, for instance, as being in the separatist camp, and they weren't. They were actually working from within the system. So in any case, Williams decided because of his position, he was probably not going to be welcome very long in England. So he and Mary get on a ship and sailed to Boston in 1631, which is just 1 year after Winthrop landed there, you know, the city on the hill, John Winthrop. And Winthrop was actually a work within kind of person. Pardon me. Morning stuff. And Winthrop gave him a position of a really prestigious church in Boston, and Williams would not accept it because he's like, no, we have to leave the Church of England. We can't work from within it. And so he left Boston and migrated to Salem first, and then to Plymouth. And wherever he went, he tended to have falling out with people. So the Plymouth people weren't happy with him because he told them the land they were on, it belonged to the Native Americans. They called them Indians back then, and they should have paid for it. And a charter from the king isn't going to hack it because it was their land. The king has no right to give it to you. So they said, well, you know what? You can just, you can leave our land and go somewhere else. So he went back to Salem in 1633 and became a preacher there. And that's when he started preaching, you should have bought the land from the Native Americans. He learned Algonquin so that he could actually speak with and mediate between the settlers and the natives, which was really impressive. And he had a lot of sympathy for Native Americans. But he also started preaching, that they should have purchased land from the natives where they were living in Salem. And B, he started preaching that the state, the magistrates, have no authority to interfere with matters of religion. And we're not quite sure where this idea came from. It's not like somebody else influenced him, because a lot of the Puritans have no problem with this. Calvin had no problem with this, and a lot of them, including Williams, are coming out of the theology of John Calvin and Theodore Beza and people in that tradition. And so this, of course, goes to preaching against the magistrates in religion went directly against the Puritans, and because they thought that one of the principal responsibilities of the magistrate or the civil authority was protecting the church, sustaining the church. And you can see this actually in the Cambridge platform, which it's at the very top of your reading. It's 1648, so it's 15 years after this, but it very much represents what the Cambridge, Massachusetts people, or the Massachusetts Bay Colony thinkers thought of this issue. And you can see right out of the gate, they're not going to be happy with Roger Williams. The end of the magistrate's office, it says, is not only the quiet and peaceable life of the subject in matters of righteousness and honesty, that would be kind of the civil social, but also in matters of godliness, or another word for that is piety, yea, of all godliness. So they're actually, you're subject to them in terms of godliness, not just in terms of civic peace. Idolatry, blasphemy, heresy, venting corrupt and pernicious opinions that destroy the foundation, open contempt of the word preached, profanation of the Lord's day, disturbing the peaceable administration and exercise of the worship and holy things of God, and the like, are to be restrained and punished by civil authority. And then it goes on to say, if anyone, one or more, church shall grow schismatical, in other words, if you decide to leave, rending itself from the communion of other churches, or shall walk incorrigibly and obstinately in any corrupt way of their own, contrary to the rule of the word, in such case the magistrate is to put forth his coercive power as the matter shall require. Right? Isn't that interesting? So the magistrate will coerce people leaving the church to rejoin, so they can't be schismatic. By the way, this understanding goes all the way back to Augustine. Augustine used the Roman state to compel the Donatists to return to the Catholic Church. And it's the parable when Jesus says the king had a wedding feast and invited people and they didn't show up. And he says, go out into the highways and byways and compel them to come in. Augustine's like, well, we're going to compel them to come in with Roman soldiers, right? So and then the other precedent for this would be Israel, biblical Israel. And so they say the tribes on this side of the Jordan intended to make war against the other tribes for building the altar of witness, whom they suspected to have turned away therein from following the Lord. That's a true story. So the people on the far side of the Jordan River built an altar, and the tribes on the western side of the Jordan River thought that they were schismatical, right? And they forbade them to do that. So they're looking to biblical Israel as a precedent for why the state has the authority to coerce unity. And as we'll see, William disagrees with that. So you can imagine his preaching wouldn't go over very well. So Salem asks him to leave. And then in October of 1635, Williams is charged by the Massachusetts Bay Colony with, quote, new and dangerous opinions against the authority of the magistrates. And by the way, everybody in this era hated what Williams was saying. Everybody, right? So he is like this renegade. No one had ever heard of something being preached like this. So he decided he'd better leave before he was arrested. He thought he might actually be sent back to England, which was entirely possible. So he flees Salem and the Massachusetts Bay Colony to avoid arrest, leaving his wife and children behind. They're reunited later, and he leaves in a blizzard, right? And so he's wandering south toward what became Rhode Island and has really no way of saving his life or anything. He would have frozen to death. And the native people, the Wampanoag tribe, whose language he could speak, found him, a hunting party found him, and they brought him into their camp, and that's how he survived the winter. So it's really quite a remarkable story. And then in the spring, he went down to the bay, which we would call Narragansett Bay. The Narragansett tribe was in control there, and he negotiated with them to have them give him land, which became Providence, Rhode Island, and of course named the bay Narragansett Bay after them. And Providence, Rhode Island, because the providence of God allowed him to reach a safe haven, right? And so then he created a city, a settlement in which his ideas of a church free of all interference by the magistrate would be possible. And it's very interesting because the first synagogue built in the United States was in Providence, Rhode Island. The first Baptist church, everybody hated the Baptists at this point. The first Baptist church was built in Providence, Rhode Island, and the first Quaker house, meeting house, was built in Providence, Rhode Island. So they put their money where their mouth was, right? So it was a very diverse community. By the way, the synagogue, the Jews had a habit because of persecution of, under the Torah scroll, they would actually have an escape hatch. So the rabbi, if people came to burn the synagogue down or to arrest him or whatever, he would hide under where the Torah scroll was in the ark. And when they built the synagogue in Providence, they built that hideaway because they were like, yeah, sure. We know what you Gentiles are like. We're not taking any chances. Yeah.
Great letter from George Washington synagogue, right? That
Oh yeah. That's part of that series of letters that I was referring to. We'll be talking about that October 15th at the Hamilton brunch version of this series. So, but it's really interesting. Yeah, there's the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island writes to him, and because there's no First Amendment yet, and they're like, so we really hope that you, and they use the phrase religious and civic liberty in that letter, and he uses it in reply. So those letters are absolutely fascinating between Washington and these different religious groups. One of them, I think it's Congregationalist, but it might have been Presbyterians, tries to bait him into becoming much more pious than he was. And so they say, we love the Constitution, which had been passed by then, obviously, because he's president, but the First Amendment had not. And they said, but as we read it, we just wondered, there's something missing. Couldn't somewhere it have been said, the one true God and Jesus Christ whom he has sent? And Washington writes back and says, true piety is much too self-evident for it to benefit from being in the Constitution. So there are all these people trying to bait him into being more Orthodox Christian, and he won't do it. So anyway, so we'll look at that engagement later on, but it is very much still part of this situation. So in 1643, as he's establishing his community in Providence, William sails back to England to get a charter for the settlement of his community, so he could actually be acknowledged as being allowed to do this by the king. And that charter is on the second page. We'll look at that toward the end. He finally won it in 1663, so it took 20 years to win it, but he did get it. And while he's there, he finishes writing the work that we're looking at today, which is called The Bloody Tenant of Persecution for Cause of Conscience, discussed in conference between truth and peace. And he publishes it in London because the only publishing house that he had access to was in Boston. And of course, they're not going to publish this book, right? So he gets it published in London and dedicates it to Parliament. And Parliament thanks him by ordering it to be burned. Seriously, like the minute it comes out, they want it burned. And so William, luckily, got a few authors' copies, maybe, and pirated them back and brought them back to the continent, to this continent, which is why we have it now. And Mercer University Press has published a new updated edition of it. It's really an amazing book. It's very, he wrote it on the run. He wrote it under haste. And so we'll look at the, what I have from it is his outline for it, sort of the introduction and chapter heading, but these are not actually the way the chapters proceed. But they do give you a list of the topics he discusses in the book, which is why I thought there really wasn't a better way to get at what's going on in the book besides this list. But they're not discussed in that order in the book, which is why I'll be jumping around a little bit. But isn't that great? So he dedicates it to Parliament and they thank him by burning it. So they really, I mean, everybody hated this position. We're so used to it now because of the First Amendment, but we have no idea what an anomaly that is. It's an incredible anomaly, not only now, but global. I mean, not only then, but globally now. It's a very unusual position. So what's his point? What's Roger Williams trying to do? Well, the best way to understand his argument is to attend to the cries that he hears. And he mentions this in the fourth point, where, you know, first, secondly, thirdly, on the first page. He says, fourthly, the doctrine of persecution for cause of conscience is proved guilty of all the blood of the souls crying out for vengeance under the altar. And there's a scene in the book of Revelation where the souls of the martyrs under the altar are crying out for vengeance. And so he hears these cries. He hears the cries of people persecuted for cause of conscience. Not just the early Christians who were persecuted by Rome for their faith, which he thought was to be expected, but the cries of other Christians who are persecuted by other Christians for cause of conscience, which he thought was absolutely wrong, right? And so when he gets to those, he's especially thinking, first of all, of the cries of other religious traditions against Christians, especially Jews who had by now suffered for 1,600 years of Christian anti-Judaism in various forms, including expulsion from England and France and Germany and places like that, and as well as the Crusades, and also Muslims who had suffered from the various Crusades as well. And so he hears this cry from Muslims and Jews concerning, quote, the bloody, irreligious, and inhuman oppressions and destructions under the mask or veil of the name of Christ. So he's hearing the cries of members of non-Christian traditions saying, you take the name of Christ and you're doing this to us? You're killing us in his name? Really? So that's one cry. Then the other cry is one that's still going on, and that's coming from the 30 Years' War on the continent. And so it's 1644, the 30 Years' War ends in 1648, so it's still going on when he writes this book. And the estimates now about how many people were killed as a direct result of that war, often by sieges, they would starve to death in a siege or from illness and things like that, were between 4 million and 12 million people, which given the population of England at that time, or Europe at that time, is about a fifth or more of the population killed. And Williams knows this, right? And so there's the cry of the Christians killed during the 30 Years' War, and he describes their cry thus: the cry of the whole earth, made drunk with the blood of its inhabitants, slaughtering each other in their blinded zeal for conscience, for religion, against the Catholics, against the Lutherans, etc. What fearful cries within these 20 years of hundreds of thousands of men, women, children, fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, old and young, high and low, plundered, ravished, slaughtered, murdered, famished. All in the name of Jesus, by the way. According to Williams, These cries come from the way that the church disobeyed the mandate that Christ gave them to grant freedom to all forms of conscience. They tend to talk about religion as conscience, to all forms of conscience and worship until Judgment Day. And he finds this command in a parable of the wheat and the weeds in Matthew 13, 24 through 30. And I didn't include it in the reading because it would have taken up more room and Williams wouldn't have been able to speak. So I'll just read it to us just to refresh our memory, because it really is the foundation of his argument. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? In other words, pull them up? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So that's the parable, right, that he's going to base everything on, because it's an imperative. Let them both grow together until the harvest. It's not like, you might let them both, it's like, let them both grow together, right? So Williams rejects the traditional interpretation of this parable, which is everywhere, but Calvin had this as well, which claims that the weeds or tares are hypocrites within the church who cannot be removed without damaging the wheat. Williams argues instead that the tares are the seeds planted by the devil, and we don't view usually hypocrites as planted by the devil, which would mean all forms of religion and conscience apart from the gospel of Christ Jesus. And so these are other forms of worship besides the worship instituted by Jesus. Williams understands the imperative of let them alone until the harvest, or let them both grow until the harvest, to mean that, quote, and we see this now in the sixth thing on the first page, sixthly, it is the will and command of God. Right, so he makes this a command. That since the coming of his son, the Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christian consciences and worships be granted to all people in all nations and countries. And they are only to be fought against with the sword which is only in soul matters able to conquer, to wit, the sword of God's Spirit, the word of God. So the only sword Jesus wants us to use is the gospel, the preaching of the gospel, the reading of the gospel, etc., but not the sword of the magistrate, right? And he includes elsewhere in the book Indians, or Native Americans, as we would call them, and papists, right? So it's a pretty comprehensive list at this time. Later, John Adams will talk about Muslims, or Turks would be included in that list. I meant Hindus. John Adams talks about Hindus as well. So. But it's interesting that he thinks that Jesus is telling us that up until now, Israel has prohibited other forms of worship in their midst, right? And you have lots of instances of that. Josiah purges the worship of Israel in his day. Deuteronomy, it commands the Israelites to get rid of worship other than the worship of Yahweh, etc. But what Williams is saying is that whole thing is over. Right, we'll talk about that more in a bit, but when Jesus comes, he starts a whole new thing. So you can't look to Israel's behavior as a precedent for what we're doing now, what the church should be doing now. So this means, the obedience to this command means leaving all consciences and forms of worship alone, leaving them alone, and not persecuting them with the civil sword, including refusing to publish their books, not giving them space to worship, etc. He says, William says, I conceive God's messengers are charged to let them alone and not pluck them up. And they would do so by exciting and stirring up civil magistrates, kings, emperors, governors, parliaments, or general courts or assemblies to punish and persecute all such persons out of their dominions and territories as worship not the true God, according to the revealed will of God in Jesus Christ. So this is a very strong prohibition that you just must leave everyone alone. And yes, you can even say their worship is inspired by the devil. So what? Leave them alone until the harvest. Now, when the harvest comes, the Son of Man will send his angels and they'll gather the weeds up and burn them. So this is not all roads lead to God. Williams is not saying that, neither is Jesus, by the way. He is saying that, yes, they're not going to, if they stay in their communities, they're not going to survive the judgment. But that's not your job. Your job is not to execute judgment now. Your job is to let them grow until the harvest, right? And not coerce them, not suppress them, not exclude them, not marginalize them, not silence them, certainly not jail them, certainly not kill them. By doing any of that, you're directly violating the commandment Jesus gave his disciples. So all the bloodshed throughout Christian history, Williams thinks, would have been avoided had the church obeyed this command of Christ to let the tares alone until the harvest. And so that's why he says in the very first thing on page 1, first, that the blood of so many 100,000 souls, too bad he didn't know it was millions, but he probably could have guessed that, so many 100,000 souls of Protestants and Papists spilled in the wars of the present and former ages for their respective consciences is not required or accepted by Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. Now, usually you'd expect somebody to cite Jesus as the Prince of Peace to be against violence, right? And that's not his point. The Prince of Peace is for let them alone until the harvest. Let them both grow until the harvest. So it's a very, very provocative position. This also means, and I talked about this with regard to Israel, this also means that the civil authority is civil only. It doesn't have not only the peaceable life, but also matters of godliness element to it. That was Israel, right? That's not the time of Jesus for Williams. Israel's history for him is symbolical. The kingdom of Israel is symbolical of the kingdom of heaven, but it is not to be used as a template for church-state relations after the time of Jesus. And he says rightly, until Constantine, the early church followed that. They didn't view themselves as a state religion. They didn't want to enforce religious uniformity wherever they were. They let other traditions go, right? So there were Jews there were Roman idolaters, etc. They're worshiping Mars, they're worshiping Saturn, they're worshiping all sorts of things. The sun didn't matter. That's just not our affair, right? But it was when Constantine came along and exercised the sword against, and the empire started to exercise the sword against nonconformists, as they came to be called, that the trouble came in. So he says in the fifthly paragraph there on that first page, all civil states with their officers of justice in their respective constitutions and administrations, and notice he's tilting very heavily in the favor of kind of a republic, because he's not saying all civil states with their kings, he's saying all civil states with their offices of justice in their respective constitutions and administrations, I think that's really interesting, are proved essentially civil, and therefore not judges, governors, or defenders of the spiritual or Christian state and worship. So they're only to govern civil matters and to leave the consciences of their subjects alone. They're not to prohibit anything, they're not to encourage anything, they're not to suppress anything, they're not to support anything, right? Just let them all grow until the harvest, right? And then that will get sorted out, but that's not our business right now. The lack of enforced religious uniformity was often thought to be a seedbed of anarchy, right? If we don't all worship the same way, then society will become completely unhinged. You hear this today, right? One reason that our country's falling apart is that it's a Christian nation, and if we're not all Christian, the whole social glue is going to fall apart. We'll see how that plays out as we go along. But for Williams, that's not true. He says on the second page, in the 11th paragraph, he says, the permission of other consciences and worships than a state professes only can, according to God, procure a firm and lasting peace. So if you want social cohesion and peace, let them alone, right? Don't enforce uniformity. Okay, good assurance being taken, according to the wisdom of the civil state, for uniformity of civil obedience from all sorts, right? So the state can certainly enforce civil uniformity, obedience to the laws of the state, governing matters of the state, not governing matters of the spirit, right? Not governing matters of the conscience. So if you just enforce that and leave the consciences of your subjects alone, not only will you not have chaos, you will have genuine peace. If you want warfare and bloodshed, enforce uniformity of religion by the power of the state. They tried it in Europe, got 30 years war. They tried it in France, got the wars of religion. They're trying it in England, you get the Civil War of Religion, which is yet to come. Actually, the real Civil War with Cromwell is just a few years down the pike. He can feel it coming, right? They're going to execute the king in a few years, and then there's going to be a civil war, and Parliament will run the country. So he says, eighthly, at the top of page 2, God requires not a uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state. Could publish this in the New York Times, right? So God requires not a uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state, which enforced uniformity sooner or later is the greatest occasion of civil war, ravishing of conscience, he actually calls it at times rape of conscience, persecution of Christ Jesus and his servants, and of the hypocrisy and destruction of millions of souls, right? And so when you enforce uniformity and say you can't do anything unless you subscribe to the 39 Articles, which the Church of England and the English nation did, then you, in order to get an office or to vote or to have property or anything, say, okay, I believe in all the 39 Articles, and you don't. Really? That's what Jesus wanted? Liars? Enforced lying? That preserves the civil peace, right? Sure. Works really well. So, and if you want to see the net effect of that, look at the reputation of the church in places like Sri Lanka and India and other places where the English, unfortunately, our tradition, the Anglicans, enforced conformity of the peoples of those lands if they wanted to do anything, right? And the reputation and Japan, gunboat diplomacy, opening up of Japan, the reputation Christianity has is very much associated with the barrel of a gun, right? It's because that's the way they experienced it. We're going to enforce your religiosity by military force, right? Well, that's really going to win a whole lot of people over to the cause of the gospel, right? So later on, he will be proven right if you want to prove him right historically. So it's really interesting. He thinks of all the reasons why people would object to this, which I'm sure he heard from various people at the time because they were all arguing with him. They thought he was nuts. And so it doesn't lead to civil chaos. In fact, enforced uniformity leads to civil chaos and violence and bloodshed and oppression. And finally, he says it won't also lead to the evaporation of Christianity, because people thought, well, if the state doesn't support Christianity, the church is going to go away. The state is described in the prophet Isaiah. This is one of Calvin's favorite verses, that kings and queens will be nursemaids of the church. They will nurse the church the way a nurse nurses her child. So for Calvin, the job of the state is to nurse the church by building seminaries, by building universities, by providing for worship spaces, etc. And so the thought that the state would not do that anymore was absolutely appalling to them. And they're like, well, the church is just going to disappear. It's not going to thrive at all. And he says, lastly and 12thly, true civility and Christianity may both flourish. So true civility would be peace and harmony, etc., like that. And Christianity, which would be the church, may both flourish in a state or kingdom, notwithstanding the permission of diverse and contrary consciences, either of Jew or Gentile. So he's always thinking way outside the boundaries of Christian groups, right? He's not just thinking of Roman Catholic, Reformed, Lutheran, Anglican. He is thinking of those, but he's thinking of Jews, he's thinking of pagans. At other points, he speaks of anti-Christians, because in the 17th century, there are a lot of people writing against Christianity as a whole. Thomas Paine, later on in Age of Reason, will do exactly that. Voltaire and others are going to come down the line and do exactly that. The French Revolution was very anti-Christian. He doesn't know that yet, but he wouldn't be surprised. So anti-Christians you let them grow until the harvest. People can write scathing rebuttals of everything Christians believe, fine. We'll flourish, right? Let them write that. We will flourish. So it's a very provocative argument. And of course, he has absolutely no evidence, other than the early Roman period of the church, that this would be the case. But his point was, real Christianity flourished when Christians lay in cells being persecuted by the state. Real Christianity perished when Christians lie in beds of down and persecute others. That's actually a quote. I just think it sounds like Amos, doesn't it? So when the church goes from being persecuted to being the persecutor, he said, you all think, oh, the Inquisition's a horrible thing. You're doing exactly the same thing. Exactly, just for a different cause, but it's exactly the same thing. It isn't that their doctrine is wrong, it's the whole thing is wrong, right? So yeah, Eden? Mm-hmm.
They were talking about a lot of this, and it was really powerful because they had like Catholic people reading accounts of the Baptist, reading accounts of, but a lot of the discussion was about like church and how the church respond to these kinds of issues. They had some like Amish and people there who like still do like religious fellowship.
Yeah, sure.
So would Williams be like, I know he's talking about kind of the civil powers and doing that in the church. Would he still think that the church within itself should be like responding to like heresies and like disciplining people within the church?
Yes. Yeah. So that's a great question. Did everyone hear that? So the question was, first of all, the dialogue between Catholics and Anabaptists is a beautiful thing in and of itself. The Anabaptists win that, by the way, because they never killed anyone so for the faith, but still. And that would be true of any of our traditions. But the question was, would Williams' view of let them grow till the harvest apply to the community of the church itself? And the answer is no. For him, the church is a walled garden, and the tares are out there. It's a really interesting reading of it, that the farmer, the good planter, the good sower threw the seed everywhere. And the wheat then should be growing in the garden, and then the tares should be growing out in the world, along with wheat, possibly. Like Paul, one of his points is, if you kill these people when they're still Jewish or Turkish or whatever, you're killing future believers. Paul was a persecutor of the church. If the church persecuted persecutors, Paul would be dead before he became an apostle, right? It's a good point, actually. So one reason you don't do that is the wheat is out there. The wheat's not just in the church, the wheat is out there. Or the weeds might be converted into wheat, and you just don't know. He believed in the doctrine of election, and for him, he had no idea whom God was going to elect or when. And so that's another reason to leave it alone, because you're just getting involved in somebody else's business, right? But the church has every right for him to do the weeding, which is why he thinks it's ridiculous that Jesus would say, don't get rid of hypocrites. Like, well, what else is the church supposed to be doing but policing itself, as a good gardener would, and making sure that the garden is growing the right way? And so, as I said, he's a person who became very unhappy with every religious community of which he was a part. Including later on, he becomes a Baptist, and then he becomes unhappy with them. And it's disputed whether or not he called himself a seeker, or he decided, this is what I think he did, he decided that things were such a mess that you had to wait until Jesus came back and reestablished the apostolic church, that he just despaired. There are other people in the 16th century who thought the same thing, that all of these decisions about restoring the apostolic church were fantasies, that you really couldn't do it because it had been so messed up. We had no idea what Jesus was up to. So in a sense, he winds up kind of despairing of whether this garden of the church could actually exist anymore. But that's later down the line. But in 1644, he talks about the church as a walled garden in which you should be weeding, right? But not with persecution, not with the sword, not with temporal authorities, putting people in stocks, hanging them, all those things. So does that, but yeah, so that's what I love about him. He's a hard nose. He's not like, oh, Jesus is compassionate and peaceful and we should love her. No, no, no. These people are all doomed, right? When the angels come and they're still out there as tares, they're going to burn. He has no doubt about that. But that's not our job. Our job is not to burn them. We might be surprised. There might be lots of weed out there, and there might be things in our garden that are going to burn, right? So we got to be pretty careful about that. But he's not. What I like about him is it isn't kumbaya, be nice. He's a hard nose, right? And yet he says we're commanded to let Jews, Turks, pagans, anti-Christians, Indians, atheists, Lutheran, Reformed, etc., to grow until the harvest. Just leave them alone. Mind your own business. But then your business, you're absolutely right. He's not an Anabaptist, so he wouldn't do the full shunning thing. The Puritans weren't into shunning, but he would do, you have every right to call out false teaching. This is false teaching, by the way. He's saying what the church is teaching, and if it had been published then, he would have called out the Cambridge platform. This is false. This is against what Jesus said. So in that sense, he's very clear that paying attention to true and false teaching is incredibly important. And so he's not going to be one of those people, oh, doctrine, who cares about doctrine? No, it really matters. If you teach one of the principal jobs of the magistrate is enforcing religious uniformity, that's incredibly destructive, he thinks. It really matters to argue against that. So it's a really good question. So yeah, and that makes them really complicated. You can see why, people try to figure out, well, where did he wind up? In a way, it doesn't matter, because what he created in Rhode Island was this incredible community where the first synagogue was built, the first Quaker meeting house was built, people hated Quakers. Oh my God. They would persecute them, they would arrest them, they'd jail them, they'd cut their ears off, they'd cut their tongues out, kill them. My wife's ancestors in New England they were Congregationalists, and one of their members became a Quaker, and they sold her into slavery. Like that'll solve that problem, right? So Quakers were very persecuted back then. Now we're in Pennsylvania. Quakers ran the show forever, so we love Quakers here. But people didn't love Quakers. We'll get to Penn next time. But so anyway, that's his view. And then each of these religious communities, and the Baptists would police themselves, the Quakers would police themselves, the Anglicans would police themselves. That's fine, but as long as they leave other people alone and don't tell the magistrate, you go take those people out, you silence those people, you burn their books, like the Parliament did for I think that's fantastic. Actually, they probably wanted to burn Williams, but he got away. But miraculously, really, in a way, Charles II, once the monarchy is restored after the Civil War, Charles II, Charles III is coming tomorrow, who is, by the way, the supreme head of the Church of England to this day, right? So the Church of England has not given this up at all. He's coming, so he's Charles III. Charles I was beheaded. Charles II wasn't. Hopefully Charles III will be fine. But Charles I was beheaded because people were using the sword to adjudicate religious disputes, right? So anyway, Charles II in 1663 grants a securing of the free exercise and enjoyment of all civil and religious rights. And notice that phrase shows up, civil and religious rights, appertaining to them as our loving subjects, to preserve unto them that liberty in the true Christian faith and worship of God, which they have sought with so much travail, and with peaceable minds, so they've done it peaceably, and loyal subjection to our royal progenitors and ourselves to enjoy. And so it points out that they can't conform to the Church of England, and so they're going to give allowance to this colony to be nonconformist. And so it says in that second paragraph on the second page, Charles II has thought fit and do thereby publish, grant, ordain, and declare that our royal will and pleasure is that no person within the said colony, so notice it's limited, but still within the said colony at any time hereafter, shall in any wise be molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion, and do not actually disturb the civil peace of our said colony, but that all and every person and persons may from time to time, and at all times hereafter, freely and fully have and enjoy his or their own judgments and consciences in matters of religious commitments throughout the tract of land hereafter mentioned, notice not any further, right? They behaving themselves peaceably and quietly, and not using this liberty to licentiousness and profaneness, nor to the civil injury or outward disturbance of others, any law, statute, or clause therein contained, or to be contained, usage or custom of this realm, to the contrary hereof in any wise notwithstanding. That's that very elaborate 17th century English. But what you see is he's granting the colony of Rhode Island the freedom that Williams argued for. But he is granting Rhode Island this freedom, right? That's what the Romans called liberty. It's something a ruler gives you. It's not something you have. It's not something that's yours that the ruler has to acknowledge. It's something the ruler is giving you, right? But still, it's an incredible precedent. And it's there are other colonies, for instance, New Jersey has a non-establishment. New Amsterdam in New York City didn't have an established church either. So it's not, the novelty is not that there's no established church in Rhode Island. The novelty is the principle by which there's no established church, right? That everyone had full liberty of conscience in that territory. And so it creates a precedent that's really quite remarkable and became known immediately, not only here, not only in these colonies, but also in the continent. And so people would flock over to Rhode Island who wanted to come to the colonies and go there because they knew they'd be safe there, right? As a consequence, the surrounding colonies, especially Boston and Massachusetts Bay Colony, called it the garbage can and the sewer of the colonies because all the crap went there. Jews, papists, Quakers, all that, and they let them live there, right? So if you want to go live with the garbage, move to Rhode Island. I mean, that's just that. So we have to remember, and that's not that long ago, right? So if you allowed them all to grow until the harvest, you're basically a landfill, right? or a septic tank, right? So that was their view of Williams. So he was not, we would tend to see him now retrospectively, anachronistically. He's the hero of the peace. That you would never have guessed that in the 1600s. Never. And the other thing to note, by the way, is it was really hard for Rhode Island and Providence in particular to work this out. And he gave the citizens a lot of freedom to work it out. It was a deliberative population. There was no monarchy. They weren't under the authority of the king. And it was unruly. I mean, he really struggled to keep everybody working together, especially since he included Native Americans in the mix. Right? We don't. The First Amendment was not applied to Native Americans. Right? Williams would have been appalled. He would have been the treatment of the Native Americans subsequent to the Constitution, let alone before. He was very, very alarmed by that. On the other hand, one of the tragedies of his time, he was constantly, because he knew Algonquin, he's constantly negotiating with the Native tribes in that area. And like Conrad Weiser in this area, actually was working very hard to reconcile conflict, but Prince Philip's War broke out, and the Native tribes decided they'd had enough of these colonists, and they better act decisively now. It's going to be too late, and they burned Providence to the ground. And Williams responded by selling the natives that were captured into slavery, right? So he was very upset. So he's not, that's why I say he's not peace and love and tie-dye. And that's that would be a character flaw, I think. But you can imagine, the city that he helped to build was burned down. He felt very betrayed by the people. These were by tribes he knew, and he couldn't get them to stop. But they were so furious by the way the colonists were treating them that they figured they had to make a last stand. That's what happened. So it has kind of a tragic dimension to it. But the fact that he's constantly bringing up Indians is remarkable. And he even says, Indians don't enforce religious uniformity. Why are we doing that? He said, Indians govern themselves. They don't have kings. Why aren't we doing that? So he didn't think Indian worship was anything but idolatrous. but Indian behavior for him was exemplary. And he said, they behave a lot better than the Christians here do. So he's a very interesting person that way. Again, I want to make sure we're not putting rosy glasses on when we think about him, because he did have that later turn. But I think that's really important too, that I just read an interview with a woman at Yale Divinity School who does Native American colony relations in America. And she said it was one of the failures of the American project. I mean, obviously women and slaves were excluded. We stipulate that. But the pre-establishment clause of the Constitution never should have applied to Native Americans and never did. And you may know, there were re-education schools to deprive Native Americans of their language, culture, and religion, one of which is set up in Carlisle. And the Episcopal Church was very much involved in that, along with others like the Congregationalists. Unfortunately, my wife is like, oh my God. But yeah, so that attempt to suppress and erase Native American life and culture and religion is very, very, it's awful. And very not Roger Williams, right? He would just be really appalled. By the way, last note, just a tidbit, whenever you're traveling around and you see Devil's Tower, Devil's Canyon, Devil's something, all of those are Native American holy sites. And we went out there and called them devils because they were Native American holy sites. So that erasure is really pretty comprehensive and shocking, isn't it? So, and thank God, I mean, 85% of Native Americans are Christian, which I think is a miracle, right? It's an absolute miracle, and willingly so. There's not enforced uniformity that way. They have every reason not to be if they didn't want to be, but their numbers are increasing to such a point now that they can actually start recovering a lot of the things that were taken from them. And so their languages, their practices, their rituals, their rites and everything are gradually coming back. And they're Native American Christians, some of whom thought they had to get rid of all of that in order to be a Christian, because that's what they were told. But there are others who are trying to develop forms of Native Christianity that are just like Irish Christianity. And we don't have any problem with Polish Christianity, Irish Christianity, Russian Christianity. Why not Native American Christianity? And so it's interesting that there's a resurgence now, I think in large part because of increased education and increased population, that Native American culture is making a bit of a comeback now. And they're also winning contests to get land back too, especially a big case out in Oklahoma and another one in California. So anyway, that's a sidetrack, but not really. Because one of the things that really got him in trouble, aside from the magistrate should stay out of this, is you stole native land. And he didn't steal Rhode Island, right? He didn't steal Rhode Island. That's why he didn't think they would attack him, but they did. So anyway, so I think he and Mary die without a house. Like they never saw Providence rebuilt. They never got their house back. I can't even remember where they lived after their house was burned down, but it was pretty devastating to him. So, all right, friends. Well, thank you for your attention, and we'll do William Penn next time. Thanks, Mel.